At 11:42 in the morning on August 9th, 2025, a Mexican cruise ship was less than 8 minutes away from ramming a United States warship. In those 8 minutes, no weapons would be armed, and no battle stations would be manned. No one would fire a shot, but miscalculations would compound, protocols would fail, and momentum would decide everything. On one side was the cruise liner Estrella del Pacífico, a mid-sized Mexican vacation ship filled with families, honeymooners, and summer travelers seeking Caribbean sun. On the other side was the USS Chancellorsville, a United States Navy guided missile cruiser returning from patrol operations in the Caribbean, carrying sophisticated weapon systems and a crew trained for combat. Both vessels were navigating the approaches to the port of Veracruz. Both believed they understood the situation. Both assumed the other would yield. Neither grasped how rapidly the margin for error was disappearing. And it all began on a morning that promised nothing but routine. A dirge, written in iron. At 11 hours, 49 minutes, and 17 seconds, the bow of the Estrella del Pacífico struck the starboard side of the USS Chancellorsville. The sound that tore through both ships was a grinding, metallic scream. Steel buckled. Welds failed. Structural frames that had been engineered to withstand ocean storms collapsed under forces they were never designed to absorb. For those in the direct path of collision, there was no warning, no time to brace, no chance to escape, only sudden, violent physics. The cruise ship's bow, reinforced for ocean crossings but never designed for combat contact, crushed inward even as it drove through the warship's hull plating. The Chancellorsville's superstructure absorbed the blow across multiple compartments. Spaces that had been crew berthing, machinery rooms, and passageways became twisted wreckage in seconds. Metal tore, pipes ruptured, seawater exploded through breached plating with the force of a dam breaking. 7 United States Navy sailors died instantly or within minutes of the impact, trapped by collapsed bulkheads or drowned as cold ocean water filled spaces faster than they could escape. The warship rolled hard to port from the force, her starboard side driven down into the water. Then she snapped back as damage control systems automatically sealed compromised compartments, trapping water, but also trapping some of those still inside. Emergency lighting flickered on in darkened sections. Alarms shrieked through every deck, layering over the groaning of stressed metal and the rush of flooding water. Crew members trained for missile strikes and boarding actions now faced a threat no exercise had prepared them for, a massive civilian vessel embedded in their ship's side. On the Estrella del Pacífico, passengers in forward cabins and public spaces were thrown against walls, furniture, and each other with crushing force. The bow, structure crumpled backward, tearing through 3 decks in a cascade of destruction. 13 passengers died in the initial moments, some from blunt trauma as they were hurled into immovable objects. Others from structural collapse as walls became projectiles and ceilings became floors. Dozens more suffered serious injuries as the ship shuddered, groaned, and finally settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Both vessels remained afloat. But the calculations that had brought them to this point were now irrelevant. Only the consequences remained. The first minutes. Aboard the USS Chancellorsville, damage control teams moved with practiced precision, born from endless drills and ingrained discipline. Sailors fought flooding with portable pumps, their hands working automatically, even as their minds struggled to process what had happened. They shored up weakened bulkheads with wooden beams and steel braces, racing against water that rose inch by inch. They established casualty collection points in undamaged spaces, carrying their wounded shipmates with desperate care. The ship's medical officer and corpsman worked frantically to triage the injured, but several injuries exceeded their onboard capabilities. Compound fractures, internal bleeding, head trauma. The kind of wounds that needed hospital operating rooms, not a ship's medical bay. The Chancellorsville's captain, injured but conscious with blood streaming from a head laceration, maintained command from the bridge. His face was pale, his uniform torn, but his voice remained steady as he transmitted emergency signals and requested Coast Guard and Navy support. Within minutes, he also did something his training had prepared him for, but his instincts resisted. He ordered his crew to render assistance to the ship that had just killed his sailors. On the Estrella del Pacífico, chaos was less organized. Most crew members had no military training and no experience with catastrophic damage. Passengers screamed, pushed toward stairwells, and searched desperately for missing family members. Children cried for their parents. Parents cried for their children. The ship's medical staff was overwhelmed within minutes, their small clinic, designed for seasickness and minor injuries, now facing mass casualty triage. The captain, shaken but functional, transmitted distress calls in both Spanish and English, his voice breaking as he described the scene before him. Navy helicopters arrived within 38 minutes, their rotors beating the air as they lowered rescue swimmers and medical teams onto both ships. Coast Guard cutters converged on the scene, their crews ready to evacuate or provide damage control support. Mexican Navy vessels, initially racing to assist their civilian ship, found themselves working alongside the same American warships they conducted wary patrols near. Old tensions dissolved in the face of immediate human need. The contradiction was not lost on anyone present. Hands that had been ready to fight now worked together to preserve life. By the 3-hour mark, the most critically injured had been evacuated by helicopter to shore hospitals. Both ships were stable enough to remain afloat, though neither could navigate safely. Tugboats were already being dispatched. The crisis had shifted from immediate survival to uncomfortable questions. How does a cruise ship ram a warship? If you're into breakdowns like this, where seconds, systems, and human decisions collide, hit subscribe now. 15 minutes before. At approximately 11 hours and 34 minutes, the paths of both vessels reached a critical intersection point. The Estrella del Pacífico was approaching the shipping lanes leading to Veracruz, following standard commercial traffic routes used by hundreds of ships each year. These were well-established paths, marked on every nautical chart, monitored by port authorities, and as familiar to her officers as highways to daily commuters. The USS Chancellorsville was completing a patrol transit, following a course that kept her in international waters, but close enough to monitor regional maritime activity. Her Aegis combat system tracked dozens of surface contacts, painting them as digital symbols on glowing screens. Tankers, container ships, fishing vessels, and yes, cruise ships. Most were classified as routine commercial traffic, filtered by automation into categories that demanded little active attention. When the Estrella appeared on the Chancellorsville's radar, she was initially cataloged as exactly what she was, a civilian cruise ship on a predictable course. Under normal circumstances, the two ships would have passed with miles of separation, each aware of the other, but requiring no special action. But circumstances were not normal. The Estrella's navigation systems had been experiencing intermittent failures for the past 6 hours. The ship's officers noticed occasional glitches in their global positioning system display and compass heading indicators. Numbers would flicker, position updates would lag. But the backup systems seemed to be compensating. The course looked right when they checked it against landmarks. The issues appeared minor, the kind of technical annoyance that maintenance would address at the next port. What they didn't realize was that their position data was drifting, showing them approximately 700 meters north of their actual location. The error was growing, subtle and silent, invisible to everyone relying on the instruments. On the bridge of the Estrella, the officers saw clear water ahead. Their screens showed they would pass well clear of any traffic. The warship they could see on the horizon appeared to be on a parallel course, far enough away to pose no concern. Just another gray ship doing whatever military ships do. On the Chancellorsville, the watch team saw something different. The Estrella's automatic identification system data showed her on a safe course, broadcasting her position, heading, and speed exactly as regulations required. But visual observation and radar tracking revealed a discrepancy. The cruise ship appeared to be several hundred meters south of where her broadcast data said she should be. The junior officer of the deck noted the inconsistency and reported it to the officer of the deck. They discussed it briefly, running through possibilities. Was the automatic identification system data wrong, or were their sensors misreading? The Estrella was clearly visible, large and well lit, transmitting proper identification. There was no indication of hostile intent, no reason to suspect deception. They decided the most likely explanation was a calibration error on their own systems, perhaps residual effects from recent equipment maintenance. The cruise ship's broadcast data seemed authoritative, official, coming from verified equipment. They adjusted their threat assessment accordingly, marking the contact as routine. Both bridges now operated on flawed information. The Estrella believed she had plenty of room. The Chancellorsville believed the Estrella would pass clear based on her declared position. Neither understood that the gap between perception and reality was closing at a combined speed of nearly 40 knots. A morning without warning. The Estrella del Pacífico carried 1,800 passengers and 600 crew. She was not a floating resort like the megaships that dominated Caribbean routes, but she offered comfortable cabins, decent food, and affordable access to beaches and historic ports. Her passengers were middle-class Mexican families saving up for annual vacations, young couples on honeymoons with modest budgets, retirees on fixed incomes who had planned this trip for years. Many had saved for months to afford this week of escape from ordinary life. The ship's officers on the bridge were experienced coastal navigators. They knew these waters, had made this approach to Veracruz dozens of times. When the global positioning system acted strangely, they noted it in the log, but trusted their backup systems and their own judgment. The ocean looked exactly as it should. Traffic was light. Visibility was excellent. Everything felt routine. On the USS Chancellorsville, the morning watch had settled into familiar patterns. Sailors performed equipment checks, monitored communications channels, and maintained the endless cycle of maintenance that keeps a warship functional. The operations specialist standing watch in the Combat Information Center tracked surface contacts with practiced efficiency. His eyes moving across displays he had stared at for hundreds of hours. The ship was in what the Navy calls Condition 3, a normal steaming watch with reduced manning, but full capability to respond if needed. The crew had been at sea for 6 weeks, conducting presence operations and showing the flag in international waters throughout the Caribbean. They were 3 days from home port in Norfolk, Virginia, and already thinking about families, friends, and shore leave. Neither ship's crew had any reason to expect that their normal morning was about to end in wreckage. Contact without understanding. At 11 hours and 37 minutes. A lookout on the Chancellorsville noted that the cruise ship appeared closer than expected. He reported it to the bridge using standard terminology, his voice calm and professional. Surface contact. Bearing 095. Range decreasing. Aspect angle suggests possible crossing situation. The officer of the deck acknowledged and checked the automatic identification system display. The Estrella's broadcast data still showed her on a parallel course with adequate separation. The numbers looked safe. He looked through binoculars at the actual ship. There was definitely a discrepancy, but he had seen sensor glitches before. Equipment drifted out of calibration, software had bugs. The ship was clearly visible, obviously a civilian cruise liner, and showed no erratic behavior. No sudden turns, no speed changes, nothing that suggested intent or danger. He ordered a radio call on the bridge-to-bridge channel. Motor vessel Estrella del Pacífico. This is United States Navy warship on your port quarter. Request you confirm your current heading and closest point of approach. On the Estrella's bridge, the radio call came through clearly. The captain himself responded in accented but clear English. "United States Navy vessel. This is cruise ship Estrella del Pacífico. Our heading is 112 degrees, speed 15 knots, bound for Veracruz. We show you on our port beam with safe passing distance." Over. The officer of the deck on the Chancellorsville frowned. The heading the cruise ship reported matched her automatic identification system data perfectly. But it didn't match what his eyes and radar were telling him. He made a decision that, in retrospect, would be examined by investigators for months. He chose to trust the transmitted data over his sensors. It seemed like the reasonable choice. Why would a cruise ship lie about its position? Estrella, understood. Maintain your course and speed. Chancellorsville, standing by on this channel. On the Estrella's bridge, this exchange confirmed what they already believed. The warship saw them, acknowledged their course, and had no concerns. The American Navy was professional and competent. Everything was normal. They returned their attention to the approach to Veracruz, reviewing port procedures and passenger disembarkation schedules. In the Combat Information Center of the Chancellorsville, the operations specialist noticed the continuing discrepancy between the cruise ship's radar return and her automatic identification system data. The gap was persistent, not fluctuating like a sensor error typically would. But without alarm indicators or hostile behavior, and with the bridge watch already in radio contact with the vessel, he didn't escalate the observation. The system showed no collision risk based on the transmitted position data. He logged the discrepancy and moved on to other contacts. 4 minutes had passed. The ships were now less than 2 nautical miles apart and closing. The window for easy correction was closing with them. The geometry of inevitability. At 11 hours and 41 minutes, the visual discrepancy became impossible to dismiss. Multiple watchstanders on the Chancellorsville simultaneously realized that the cruise ship was not where she said she was. She was, in fact, on a direct collision course. The realization hit like cold water. The officer of the deck immediately ordered all engines back full. Rightful rudder, sound collision alarm. The alarm shrieked through the warship, a sound every sailor knew but hoped never to hear in reality. Sailors grabbed for handhelds and braced themselves against whatever was nearby. In the engine rooms 4 decks below, throttles slammed into reverse. The Chancellorsville's powerful gas turbines howled as they fought against the ship's momentum, vibrations shuddering through the hull. But a 9,000-ton guided missile cruiser traveling at 20 knots cannot stop quickly. The laws of physics are indifferent to urgency, immune to training, blind to consequence. On the bridge of the Chancellorsville, officers watched in mounting horror as the cruise ship, massively larger and moving steadily forward, continued to close. The captain, who had been in his at-sea cabin reviewing operations reports, sprinted to the bridge in seconds. He burst through the door, instantly grasped the situation from the faces of his officers and the positions on the radar display. Signal them again. Tell them to turn now. Estrella del Pacífico. Estrella del Pacífico. This is United States Navy warship. You are on collision course. Turn to starboard immediately. Turn to starboard now. On the Estrella's bridge, the urgent transmission finally triggered alarm. The tone was unmistakable. The captain looked forward through the bridge windows and felt his stomach drop. The warship was much closer than his instruments indicated. Much closer. And they were heading directly toward it. The angle was all wrong. The distance was collapsing. He grabbed the engine telegraph and rang for full astern, the brass handle slamming forward with desperate force. He shouted for hard right rudder. Crew members jumped to execute, but they all knew, even as they moved, what the numbers meant. The Estrella del Pacífico was not built for rapid maneuvering. She displaced 23,000 tons and stretched 190 meters from bow to stern. Her single propeller and conventional rudder meant she turned like what she was, a floating hotel, built for comfort, not evasion. The captain's mind raced through the mathematics of disaster. distance, speed, turning radius, stopping distance. Every calculation reached the same conclusion, arriving at the same impossible answer. They weren't going to make it. On the Chancellorsville, sailors on weather decks saw the cruise ship's bow looming larger, filling their field of vision. Some, operating on instinct and training, moved away from the starboard side, putting bulkheads between themselves and what was coming. Others, frozen by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing, simply stared. A cruise ship was about to ram a warship. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this reversal. The last 30 seconds felt both instantaneous and eternal. Orders were shouted. Metal groaned under the stress of emergency maneuvers. And physics, patient and implacable, finished what confusion had started. Evidence without excuses. The investigation began before the ships had even been separated by tugboats. Voyage data recorders were secured and sealed. Radar tracks were downloaded. Radio transmissions were archived. Automatic identification system data logs from multiple shore stations were requested and compiled. Dozens of witness statements were recorded from both crews. Video footage from the Chancellorsville's security cameras was reviewed frame by frame. Passenger footage from the Estrella, captured on phones held by shaking hands, was collected and analyzed. Satellite tracking data was requested through diplomatic channels and received. When investigators aligned all the evidence chronologically, creating a minute-by-minute reconstruction, the sequence became undeniable. The Estrella del Pacífico's navigation system had suffered a cascading failure in its global positioning system receiver and backup compass correction software. The failure was subtle, not the kind of catastrophic breakdown that triggers obvious alarms and forces immediate response. But it was severe enough to create a position error that grew steadily over several hours. The ship's officers, trusting their instruments and seeing no visual contradictions in open water far from landmarks, had no way to detect the drift. Everything looked normal because the false position and the real position both showed open ocean. The USS Chancellorsville's watch team had correctly identified the discrepancy between the Estrella's broadcast position and her actual location. They had noted it, discussed it, and made a judgment call. But their training and doctrine pushed them toward trusting authenticated automatic identification system data from a verified civilian ship over their own sensors. When faced with choosing between our equipment has a glitch and a cruise ship is lying about its position, they chose the former, because the latter made no sense in their operational context. Ships don't fake their positions. Equipment drifts out of calibration all the time. Neither the Chancellorsville's collision avoidance systems nor the Estrella's bridge team recognized the true danger until it was too late for ships of their size and momentum to avoid impact. By the time human judgment identified the threat, physics had already decided the outcome. There was no hostile intent. There was no recklessness. There was no deliberate violation of maritime law. There was equipment failure, reasonable misinterpretation, and a fundamental mismatch between commercial navigation practices and military vessel operations. If this story made you think, share your perspective in the comments below. What warnings did you see that the crews missed? Subscribe for more true accounts of when systems fail and people pay the price. And hit like to keep these critical lessons visible, because the best memorial to those who died is making sure it never happens again.